For decades, Sylvester Stallone was the man who refused to fall. He turned impossible odds into legendary victories, created characters that inspired millions, and became a symbol of survival itself. But behind the fame, the action scenes, and the unstoppable image, a different story was quietly unfolding. A story filled with painful losses, personal battles, and moments that changed the way the world saw him. Now, as Stallone faces a new chapter of his life, fans are asking a question nobody expected to ask. Is this truly the final goodbye to one of Hollywood's last great action icons? Before Sylvester Stallone became the face of some of Hollywood's most unforgettable characters, he was a struggling actor who seemed destined to remain invisible. Long before the world knew him as Rocky Balboa or John Rambo, Stallone was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with movie villains or impossible missions. His greatest opponent was rejection. Born with a partially paralyzed lower left side of his face due to complications during his birth, Stallone grew up with a distinctive voice and appearance that many believed would prevent him from becoming a leading man. Casting directors often overlooked him, telling him that he did not have the traditional image of a Hollywood star. But instead of accepting their judgment, Stallone used those criticisms as motivation. During his early years in New York, success seemed impossibly far away. He struggled financially, took small acting roles, and at one point faced a desperate situation where he had to sell his beloved dog because he could not afford to keep him. For Stallone, Hollywood was not a glamorous dream. It was a daily fight for survival. Then came the moment that changed everything. While watching a boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner, Stallone found inspiration for a story about an unknown fighter who gets one impossible opportunity to prove himself. That idea became Rocky, a film that would eventually become one of the most celebrated sports dramas in history. But what many people forget is that Stallone was not simply the star of the movie. He wrote the screenplay himself, and when studios became interested, they wanted to buy the script but replace him as the lead actor. They saw value in the story, but they did not see value in the man who created it. Stallone refused. Even when offered large amounts of money to walk away from the role, he insisted that he had to play Rocky Balboa. He believed the character's struggle reflected his own journey, an ordinary person fighting against impossible odds. That decision changed his life forever. When Rocky was released in 1976, it became a phenomenon. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, turned Stallone into a superstar, and transformed a struggling actor into a symbol of determination around the world. But success brought a new challenge. The man who built his career on being the underdog suddenly had to live up to the image of being unstoppable. Fans no longer saw just Sylvester Stallone. They saw the heroes he created. And behind that powerful image was a person who still carried the same fears, doubts, and insecurities from the days when nobody believed in him. The rise of Sylvester Stallone was a story about refusing to lose. But the higher he climbed, the more difficult the next battles became, and some of those battles would happen far away from the movie screen. The world saw Sylvester Stallone as a man who had conquered everything. He had created legendary characters, built a career spanning generations, and transformed himself into one of the biggest action stars in history. But the image of the unstoppable fighter came with a hidden cost. After the success of Rocky, Stallone entered a world where every decision was judged, every failure was magnified, and every comeback had to be bigger than the last. Hollywood had rewarded him for creating heroes who never gave up, but that same expectation followed him everywhere. Audiences wanted another Rocky. They wanted another Rambo. They wanted the same intensity, the same determination, and the same larger-than-life performances that made him famous. But constantly proving yourself at the highest level can become its own kind of pressure. Stallone spent decades pushing his body to the limit for his roles. He trained intensely, performed dangerous stunts, and often demanded more from himself than most actors would consider reasonable. The injuries accumulated over the years, reminding him that even the strongest action heroes eventually face physical limits. Yet the biggest challenges were not always physical. Behind the success was the difficult reality of maintaining a career in an industry that constantly searches for the next new star. As Hollywood changed, Stallone had to fight against the perception that action legends from earlier generations no longer had a place at the center of the spotlight. For a man whose identity was built around winning, stepping away was never easy. Instead of disappearing, Stallone repeatedly reinvented himself. He returned to characters that audiences thought they had seen for the last time. He found new ways to tell stories about aging fighters, forgotten champions, and people searching for one more chance. Those stories carried a deeper meaning because they reflected something personal. Stallone was no longer just playing characters trying to prove themselves. He was portraying the same struggle he experienced in real life. But while fans celebrated his professional victories, his private life carried struggles that were far less visible. The same man who could portray courage on screen faced moments of heartbreak away from cameras. Fame could bring admiration for millions, but it could not protect him from personal pain, family challenges, or the emotional weight that comes with decades in the public eye. The world continued seeing Stallone as the fighter who always stood back up. Few people understood how much strength it required to maintain that image when life delivered challenges that no script could rewrite. And eventually, Stallone would face losses that changed the way he looked at success, family, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Those moments would become some of the most defining chapters of his life and reveal a side of the Hollywood icon that audiences rarely saw. For most of his career, Sylvester Stallone was known as the man who survived impossible situations. His characters were built around resilience, fighters who took devastating blows, fell to the ground, and somehow found the strength to rise again. But real life does not always follow the same rules as a movie script. Away from the bright lights of Hollywood, Stallone experienced moments of pain that changed him in ways no role ever could. One of the most devastating chapters of his life came with the loss of his son, Sage Stallone, in 2012. Sage, who followed his father into the entertainment world, had appeared alongside Stallone in the 1990 film Rocky V. To fans, their relationship represented a rare glimpse into Stallone's life beyond the screen, a father and son sharing a Hollywood moment together. But that connection was shattered when Sage died at the age of 36. The loss affected Stallone deeply. The public was used to seeing him as a powerful figure who could handle anything. But grief is a battle with no easy victory. It was a reminder that even someone who portrayed some of cinema's toughest characters could experience a pain that could not simply be overcome with determination. For Stallone, family became an even greater priority after that tragedy. The loss changed the way he viewed time, success, and the things that truly mattered. The awards, the box office numbers, and the fame that once defined his career became less important compared to the people closest to him. But this was not the only emotional challenge Stallone faced. Throughout his life, he also dealt with the complicated pressures that came from being one of the most recognizable celebrities in the world. His relationships, family decisions, and personal struggles often became public conversations, forcing him to navigate private pain under the constant attention of cameras and headlines. The world knew the character of Rocky Balboa, a man who fought for his family and refused to surrender. But the real Stallone was dealing with situations where strength looked very different. Sometimes strength meant continuing forward while carrying wounds nobody else could see. These experiences also changed the way Stallone approached his legacy. Instead of simply chasing bigger action scenes or proving he could still compete with younger stars, he began focusing more on the meaning behind his work. Characters like Rocky became more than fictional fighters. They became reflections of his own journey, stories about aging, regret, redemption, and finding purpose after loss. As Stallone grew older, audiences started noticing something different. The intensity was still there, but beneath it was a deeper sense of reflection. The man who once built his reputation on physical toughness was now showing another kind of courage, the willingness to acknowledge vulnerability. And that raised a question many fans had never considered before. If Sylvester Stallone, the ultimate movie survivor, had already faced battles that changed him forever, What would happen when he reached the final stage of his legendary career? Because the next challenge was not about fighting enemies or winning championships, that it was about facing time itself. For decades, Sylvester Stallone represented something almost impossible in Hollywood: the ability to keep coming back. Every time audiences thought his era had passed, he found another way to surprise them. Every time the industry moved on, he created another opportunity to remind the world why his name mattered. But eventually, even legends have to confront a reality they cannot defeat: time. As Stallone entered a new phase of his career, the nature of his roles began to change. The explosive action scenes and impossible physical challenges that defined his early years were replaced by stories that explored experience, wisdom, and the emotional weight of a life spent fighting. This shift was not an accident. Stallone understood that audiences were no longer just interested in seeing him throw punches or survive dangerous missions. They wanted to know the person behind the legend. They wanted to see what happened to the heroes after the victories, after the celebrations, and after the world stopped watching. That evolution allowed him to return to familiar characters while adding new layers to them. Rocky Balboa was no longer just the hungry fighter chasing a dream. He became an older man dealing with memories, regrets, and the meaning of everything he had sacrificed. In many ways, Stallone was telling his own story through these characters. But Hollywood is an industry that constantly changes. New stars emerge, new trends dominate, and even the biggest names eventually have to decide when to step back. For an actor whose entire identity was built around pushing forward, accepting change became one of his greatest challenges. Fans began wondering how much longer they would see Stallone leading major projects. Was he preparing for retirement? Was he slowing down? Or was he simply entering another transformation? The questions became louder because Stallone had always been associated with one idea: never surrender. Walking away from the spotlight would not just mean ending a career. It would mean closing a chapter that had inspired millions of people around the world. Yet behind the public image of the unstoppable fighter was a man who had experienced success, heartbreak, loss, and reinvention. The same determination that carried him from poverty to international fame was still present, but now it was being tested in a different way. The final stage of Stallone's journey was no longer about proving that he could win. It was about deciding what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. And as fans looked back at everything he had accomplished, one question remained. After a lifetime of creating unforgettable heroes, what would Sylvester Stallone's own final story become? When people talk about Sylvester Stallone, they often begin with the obvious: the movies, the awards, the iconic characters, and the unforgettable moments that made him a Hollywood legend. But his true legacy was never just about box office numbers or how many action scenes he completed. It was about what his story represented. Stallone became famous because he created characters who were not perfect. Rocky Balboa was not the strongest fighter, the most talented athlete, or the person everyone expected to win. He was someone who kept moving forward when the odds were against him. That message connected with millions of people because Stallone's own journey mirrored it. Before the fame, before the expensive homes, and before the worldwide recognition, he was an actor many people dismissed. His appearance, his voice, and his unconventional path made Hollywood underestimate him. Instead of allowing those obstacles to define him, he turned them into the foundation of his career. That is why characters like Rocky and Rambo became more than entertainment. They became symbols of persistence. Generations of fans saw themselves in those stories. People who had been overlooked, underestimated, or forced to fight battles nobody else understood. Stallone gave those people a hero who was not born extraordinary, but became extraordinary through determination. But as his life continued, his legacy became about more than survival. The later chapters of Stallone's story showed a different kind of strength. They showed a man dealing with personal loss, changing priorities, and the reality of aging in an industry built around youth. Instead of pretending those struggles did not exist, he allowed them to influence the stories he told. That made his characters feel more human. The older Rocky was not the same person audiences met decades earlier. He carried memories, regrets, and emotional scars. But that vulnerability made him more powerful, because it showed that strength is not only about winning fights. Sometimes it is about continuing despite everything life takes away. For Stallone, the greatest victory may not have been becoming famous. It may have been proving that a person can rewrite their own story. From a struggling actor with limited opportunities to one of the most recognizable figures in cinema history, his career became an example of persistence against impossible odds. But every great journey eventually reaches a moment of reflection. After decades of giving audiences heroes who refuse to quit, Stallone now faces the question every legend eventually encounters. How will the world remember him when the final chapter is written? Will he be remembered only as the man who created Rocky and Rambo? Or will people remember something deeper? The story of a person who spent his entire life fighting for one more chance, one more dream, and one more comeback? Because the final measure of Sylvester Stallone's life may not be how many battles he won on screen. It may be how many people he inspired to keep fighting their own. For more than 5 decades, Sylvester Stallone has convinced the world that every defeat can become a comeback, and every ending can become a new beginning. But as one of Hollywood's last true legends enters the twilight of his extraordinary journey, one question remains unanswered. What is the final chapter that Stallone himself has been quietly preparing for? And will the world be ready when this unforgettable icon finally says goodbye?